Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. In this video, we are going to explore a dramatic diplomatic moment that is reverberating across continents. The headline is bold: Traoré rejected Trump's $7.5 million offer. What happened next is already shifting the balance in Africa, and the ripple effects are being felt all the way to Washington. We will unpack what really took place, how it ties into larger currents in Africa today, what is happening in the United States, and why comparing both gives insight into global power, dignity, and sovereignty. Stay with me. By the end of this you will see how a single refusal can become a turning point in modern diplomacy. Introduction. The offer, the refusal, the stakes. Let's begin with what motivated all this drama. Allegations have surfaced that the Trump administration offered $7.5 million to certain African governments under a deportation deal. The idea being that some African states would accept deportees, non-citizens, expelled from the U.S. under stricter immigration enforcement. In at least one of those cases, the government of Burkina Faso, led by its military rulers and Foreign Minister Karamoko Jean-Marie Traoré, publicly and emphatically refused this offer. They rejected what they called an indecent, or undignified, proposal. In Traoré's words, Burkina Faso is a land of dignity, not a land of deportation. But this is not just about money or deportees. It opens up broader questions: which nations get to set terms? How does power operate in modern diplomacy between global powers and African states? What happens when a country says no to influence and pressure? And how will the US respond when an African government resists? So let's zoom out. First, what is the context on the African side? Then, what is happening in the US that frames this moment? After that, a side-by-side comparison, and we will close with what this might mean for the future. Section 1. What's happening in Africa: sovereignty, debt, diplomacy, and power shifts. 1.1 Burkina Faso and the rejection. The immediate flashpoint is Burkina Faso's rejection of the U.S. deportation proposal. Reports say the Trump administration had approached several African nations with deals: accept deportees and receive financial incentives. In the Burkina case, that incentive was reportedly $7.5 million. Burkina Faso declined. It said that taking non-citizen deportees offered by the U.S., beyond its own nationals, was a breach of dignity. The response has had immediate diplomatic fallout. The U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou suspended most of its visa services and shifted applications to neighboring Togo. This move signals escalating tension. If a government refuses a major financial incentive, the repercussions may be economic, political, or even coercive. Many in Africa are watching closely. 1.2 The debt, the aid cuts, and external pressure. This moment happens in a broader African landscape shaped by mounting debt burdens, shrinking foreign aid, and shifting power in global finance. Across the continent, governments are under tremendous pressure servicing debt. During South Africa's recent G20 presidency, 165 organizations criticized the failure to advance meaningful debt relief for developing nations. Billions of dollars in interest payments are draining public services, pushing states to make tough foreign policy choices. Meanwhile, U.S. foreign aid to Africa has been slashed. Since the Trump administration moved to dismantle USAID and reconfigure USAID architecture, many countries have felt sudden shortfalls in healthcare, food security, and public health projects. In Zambia, the president even called the USAID cuts long overdue, framing them as an opportunity for self-reliance. But the transition is painful. Some nations are struggling to fill the gap. At the same time, new global development players, China, the European Union, and multilateral institutions, are seeking to reorient how infrastructure, energy, and investment are made in Africa. For example, Europe recently pledged over $600 billion to support clean energy projects in Africa. African governments now must balance competing offers and choose whether or not to align more closely with former colonial powers, China, or regional blocs. 1.3 Security challenges and external military reach. Another dimension is the security landscape. Terrorist networks are growing more aggressive in the Sahel region. U.S. military commanders warn that groups in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and neighboring states are expanding operations, threatening regional stability. As these networks grow, African states are under pressure to cooperate with foreign militaries, including the US, in counterterrorism efforts. But cooperation comes with strings attached and sovereignty risks. Also, in East Africa, Somalia has offered to grant the US exclusive control over strategic air bases and ports, a move that could strengthen American military posture in the Horn of Africa. These deals show how military strategic interests intersect with diplomacy and national pride. 1.4 Peace initiatives and regional integration. Not all trends are negative. In June 2025, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda signed a US-brokered peace agreement after years of conflict over eastern DRC. That deal calls for troop withdrawals, disarmament of rebel groups, and regional economic integration. While there are concerns about implementation, it is a moment of hope that diplomacy might outpace conflict. Meanwhile, Africans are increasingly asserting their own voice in global matters. The election of a new chief of the African Union Commission, Djibouti's Foreign Minister Mahmoud Ali Yusuf, reflects internal competition and renewed energy in continental diplomacy. Also, on the technological front, African thinkers are shaping agendas in AI safety, data sovereignty, and digital infrastructure. One recent study argues for an African AI Safety Institute and localized data governance frameworks to avoid dependency on global tech giants. This shows that Africa is not just a passive receiver of external pressure, many actors seek to frame their own futures. Section 2. What's going on in the United States, policy, power, immigration and global strategy. Let's shift now across the Atlantic to the United States. When we examine U.S. motivations, constraints, and trends, we get clearer insight into why the Trump administration might push a deal like the one rejected by Traoré, and how the U.S. might respond going forward. 2.1 Immigration policy and deportation strategy. Under Trump's renewed leadership, immigration enforcement is again a central priority. Reports suggest that the U.S. has struck agreements with several African countries to accept deportees as part of a broader third-country deportation program. Some agreements include financial incentives or aid in exchange for cooperation. Rwanda, for instance, was reportedly offered incentives. The idea is that rather than deporting individuals back to their country of origin, which may pose legal, logistical, or diplomatic hurdles, the U.S. can shift the burden to partner countries. But it raises deep moral, legal, and sovereignty concerns, and that is precisely the tension Burkina Faso has chosen to highlight. 2.2 Aid retrenchment, foreign policy reset. Under the current U.S. administration, foreign aid architecture has been drastically altered. USAID's structure was dismantled, and many programs reliant on U.S. funds in health, education, and rural development have been cut. Some analysts warn that millions of Africans are being pushed back into extreme poverty by these changes. At the same time, the U.S. has signaled an attempt to reduce heavy burden programs, moving instead toward more selective engagement. But critics argue this is less about efficiency and more about shifting responsibility to nations. African states now must decide whether to resist that retraction or accept conditional aid. 2.3 Strategic competition, trade, and diplomatic posturing. In recent years, U.S. strategy has increasingly viewed Africa through a lens of great power competition, particularly with China. The U.S. wants to maintain influence, access minerals, secure trade routes, and prevent other powers from dominating the continent. Thus proposals, offers, and deals often come with strings attached: investment in infrastructure, compliance with trade or security agreements, or accepting geopolitical terms. Meanwhile, trade proposals are on the table. For example, South Africa has floated purchasing U.S. liquefied natural gas (LNG) over the next decade and linking that to broader trade deals. Also, the U.S. is scheduled to assume the G20 presidency soon, which gives it diplomatic leverage in global economic forums. Also, internal U.S. policies are shifting. The White South African Refugee Program is one controversial recent move, in which the U.S. is granting asylum to white South Africans under claims of discrimination. This drew strong pushback from South Africa as questionable in motive and legitimacy. With aid cuts, strategic readjustments, and immigration policy tightening, the U.S. is pulling in multiple directions. It seeks control, influence, and strategic advantage, but it is also constrained by domestic politics, global reputation, and resistance from global partners. 2.4 Military engagement and counterterrorism. The U.S. maintains a military presence across key regions in Africa, in the Sahel, East Africa, the Horn of Africa, and the Gulf of Guinea. Recent airstrikes against ISIS, al-Shabaab in Somalia show that the U.S. remains active in counterterrorism engagements. But as American troop deployments shrink or refocus, reliance on partner nations becomes more important, and negotiations over bases and access are contentious. The offer by Somalia to grant exclusive military control of ports and bases is one of the more striking cases reflecting how U.S. strategic needs intersect with national sovereignty. In sum, the U.S. is operating from a position of strength in many areas but requiring cooperation and consent from African states for its broader ambitions. Rejection by a state like Burkina Faso is politically risky for Washington and raises questions about the limits of influence. Section 3. Contrasting Africa and the U.S. in this moment. Now, let us draw direct contrasts and comparisons. What does this episode reveal about power, agency, and the changing order? 3.1 Sovereignty versus conditionality. One of the clearest tensions is sovereignty on one side, conditionality on the other. African states, especially those with strong leadership or unified domestic support, are pushing back on deals that imply they exist as mere satellites. Burkina Faso's refusal is a signal that states will not always accept conditional offers, even if they are financially tempting. On the U.S. side, deals are structured conditionally: aid, cooperation, or incentives in return for policy compliance or cooperation. The clash is inevitable. 3.2 Bargaining power and leverage. The U.S. holds significant leverage: military might, financial resources, global diplomatic reach. But African states also have leverage: geography, control over local populations, alternative partners, China, Russia, the EU, and moral authority to reject pressure tactics. The balance is shifting where rejecting an offer might gain political capital or regional prestige. 3.3 Narrative and soft power. The narrative of dignity is central. By framing the U.S. proposal as indecent, Traoré is engaging in a political narrative about respect and sovereignty. The U.S., in contrast, must justify its proposals domestically: immigration control, and internationally: reputation, alliances. Soft power and narrative framing are as critical as material leverage. 3.4 Risk, retaliation, and punishment. Rejecting a powerful actor's offer always carries risk. The U.S. suspension of visa services in Burkina Faso is already a retaliatory step. It demonstrates that resistance may provoke costs, in diplomacy, access, or services. African states considering resistance must weigh potential blowback. Meanwhile, the U.S. must calibrate how far to push before it damages long-term relationships and regional stability. 3.5 Multipolar alternatives. African countries now have more options. China, regional development banks, the EU, and private capital are offering alternatives. Investments in clean energy, infrastructure, and digital systems provide African states with bargaining chips. For the U.S., this means influence is no longer guaranteed and must be earned through mutual respect. Section 4. What could happen next and why it matters. Now that we've unpacked the stakes, let's imagine the likely trajectories and long-term implications. 4.1 Short-term fallout in Burkina Faso and U.S. relations. In the immediate term, visa suspension is a pressure tool. If Burkina Faso maintains its refusal, further diplomatic penalties, restrictions on trade or aid, or political isolation might follow. On the other hand, Burkina Faso may attract new partners who support its stance, boosting regional or ideological alliances. 4.2 Domino effect. Other nations take note. Burkina's decision could inspire neighboring countries to resist pressure or renegotiate terms more assertively. If one state blazes a path, others may follow, especially in contexts where national pride or internal legitimacy is at play. 4.3 Rewriting negotiation norms. If tough refusals become more common, the negotiation template across the global south may shift. Future deals may need to be more equal, transparent, and respectful of national agency. External powers may have to recalibrate how they propose cooperation. 4.4 Realigning global influence. A continent that rejects patronage and conditional offers could tilt more toward multilateral or non-Western alliances. Africa's tilt toward China or Russia, or efforts to create independent continental institutions, e.g., African Union push, regional financial mechanisms could accelerate. 4.5 U.S. Credibility and strategy testing. For Washington, how it reacts sets precedent. If it punishes refusal harshly, its soft power and moral standing may suffer. If it negotiates adjustments or shows flexibility, it could rebuild trust. The risk is that rigid strategy may backfire, undermining long-term influence. 4.6 Broader impacts on migration, security, aid, and trade. The refusal comes at a time when global migration, climate change, and security threats are intensifying. How the global powers engage with Africa now influences border policy, refugee flows, counterterrorism collaboration, and trade agreements for decades to come. Conclusion: a refusal that echoes what began as an alleged $7.5 million offer to accept deportees has become so much more. Traoré's rejection is not just a diplomatic misstep or a negotiation tactic. It is a statement of agency, an assertion of dignity, and possibly a turning point in how African states engage with external pressures. It forces us to ask, when is an offer too coercive? When does aid become control? And what happens when the weaker side says no? In the context of Africa's shifting internal dynamics, debt pressure, rising terrorism, evolving alliances, that refusal may be a signal that Africa is no longer content to be the playground of powerful states. And from the U.S. side, it is a test whether influence can be maintained by respect or enforced by penalties. If nothing else, this episode reminds us that in the realm of global affairs, the power to say no still matters. The consequence of that refusal will be written in the next chapters, whether Africa redraws its position in world affairs, and whether the U.S. learns how to engage differently. Thank you for watching. If you found value in this deep dive, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. What do you think will happen next? Do you believe African states will increasingly resist external pressure? Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep watching this space.